Hello and welcome to this episode of Physical Attraction. Now we have a special couple of guests on the show today. Listeners to our episodes about QE for the people will remember that we briefly mentioned modern monetary theory as a new perspective on how economics works, and I talked about getting some MMT speakers on the show to explore that in more detail. Now I was lucky enough to get the hosts of the MMT Podcast, Patricia, Pino and Reilly, who have interviewed many of the founding scholars and the most active economists in MMT as part of that brilliant podcast about which I've learned a lot from MMT just by listening to that. Now we had a very, very wide-ranging discussion. They were incredibly generous with their time, which I'm grateful for. As a result, I've split that episode into two episodes. The first deals with a bit of a background of MMT, exploring the historical and anthropological question, where does money come from, and some of the consequences that flow from that. And the second episode, which is longer, deals with the consequences of modern monetary theory for our society. Some ideas of how it could be used to run economies more effectively and solve many of the biggest problems that we face in the world. And it's therefore slightly more political, so there is a content warning there if you don't want to hear any discussion of politics. But I think really you should, because as we discuss in those episodes, regardless of which end of the political spectrum you come from, having a real understanding of how the actual economy works is crucial so that you can actually be an informed voter and an informed, engaged person engaging in the social and political economy that we all have to live in. So I think regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, it's important. Now, I realise that this podcast is not primarily an economics podcast, and it's never been billed as such. And I don't think that we're going to have that many economics episodes coming after this, by the way. But I have been convinced, especially recently, that so many of the concerns that we have been talking about recently, this intersection between technology, inequality, and global catastrophic risks, the necessity of dealing with climate change, and so much else in the world, is that it is necessary to have a deeper understanding of economics, which is in the background of so much that's going on in the world. MMT, to my mind, when it's properly interpreted and described, makes some points that the classical understanding of economics just misses out on. And even if you disagree with it, I think it's a fascinating area. I have certainly been fascinated by learning more about it, and I hope that you find our conversations here valuable. As ever, if you think I should abandon all this stuff and put it into a different podcast, if that's your opinion, or alternatively, if you like the sort of things that we're doing, expanding the range of topics that we cover here, you can always get in touch with me via the contact form on physicspodcast.com and let me know what you think. Or, you can just wait a few days and we'll have a different episode available for you on a different subject. Just don't ask for your money back, because podcasts are free. Without further ado, then, the second part of the interview. So getting back to the consequences of this for sort of society in general, which I think is the really sort of interesting thing and why we're all interested in this so much, alongside, of course, actually understanding how the economy works as a system, which is kind of important because we all do live in it. If the government effectively can't run out of its own money, then, which we've said, and if anyone doesn't believe me, just look at what's happened with the coronavirus, where they've demonstrated that they can't run out of their own money, and it's certainly not constrained by the tax revenues they took in the previous year, as you or my spending might be constrained by the amount of wages we got in the previous year, for example, plus what we can borrow. If the government can't run out of its own money, and we say it can't, then the only practical limit to its spending should be the level of inflation that we're getting in the economy. Obviously, if they pay everyone salaries of millions and millions of pounds a day, then the currency will quickly become worth less. So instead of focusing on the balance between government incomes through taxes versus expenditure and treating it like a monthly accounting spreadsheet, I guess, we should be looking at something like the balance between employment, economic growth, and inflation. And the things people should really be concerned about is this thing, inflation, which is a question of whether the government is basically putting enough money into the economy or not. And it seems to me like the MMT argument is that really our limit to spending should be set by the inflation in the economy and the rate that is at, and shouldn't have anything to do with the tax revenue that's sort of come in to the government beforehand. So first off, is that a fair argument? And secondly, let's talk about inflation. What drives it, and how does it limit spending?
I think that's a natural kind of next place where people go whenever they accept that, okay, the government is a currency issuer and it can never run out of pounds. The UK government and the US government can never run out of dollars. The next thing they always shout is, oh, inflation and Zimbabwe and Venezuela and etc. And then you get to the fact that a lot of people really don't have a really good understanding of what inflation is or what it's caused by. And the MMT take would be that you have you can spend up to the resources that you have. So and taxation and removing money from the economy is a way of controlling inflation. Now, I think a lot of people interpret this as almost saying that, oh, okay, so you go crazy and you spend on things and you pay people money. And then when you see inflation growing, then you tax and you slow inflation down. And I think they've got that wrong, because if you're a government and say you want to build a bridge somewhere, the first question that you'll ask is, are there people available to do this job? Is there, workforce able to do this job now? And if there is, then you spend the money, that resources are available. There is very little risk of inflation. If there isn't, the government has two choices. It can either um, um, tax to kind of reduce the number of workers undertaking other jobs in the private sector, to move resources from the private sector into the government so that it can build that bridge, or it can compete against the private sector and outbid the private sector and say, well, I'm going to pay builders a lot more money so they can build me this bridge. Obviously the second option is more likely to create inflation, because the government is increasing the prices that it's paying for workforce. So it's something that you consider preemptively whenever you are doing spending. And this is something that I think Stephanie makes that point constantly on Twitter, and that other economists don't get. And I think part of the issue is that we have, over the last 3 decades, we have had policy which has prioritized inflation control to the point of nothing else, everything else is subordinate to the idea that we need to control inflation, control the value of money, even at the expense of unemployment. We're more willing to accept that people are going hungry than we are about taking the risk of generating some inflation. And I think, well, that those set of priorities is wrong, and also it comes from the fact that we have such little understanding of what actually causes inflation, and we have become obsessed with this idea that all you have to control inflation is interest rates. And as you know, interest rates are a very blunt tool. They're holding a carrot in front of investors and hoping that they behave in the way that you want them to behave. There are no guarantees for this, and that's all that we've narrowed it down to, really, in this idea that the market decides how many people should be employed, and all we have is that these really indirect tools. And so I think MMT adds a lot to the understanding of inflation that we have, and there's really nothing else like it.
But just in this case, so we should talk about this idea that taxation is kind of destroying the pounds or the dollars or the tokens that the government has pushed out into the wider economy. And in that sense, you can use taxation to control inflation by taking some of that money out of circulation and putting it back into the government's kind of imaginary, ability to generate as much money or as little money as it wants. And then, of course, the other lever that a government informed by MMT would have to control inflation would be what it pays for goods and services, which, as you've pointed out with your bridge analogy, is another thing that they could do. And we'll get onto the universal jobs guarantee idea in a bit as well, I think. But Christian, did you have something to add to that?
When Stephanie Kelton talks about this in her book, The Deficit Myth, is she goes, let's look at how we deal with inflation now. Look at the situation we've got. Yes, the government can't run out of money. It can either spend too much and there's inflation, that is the evidence of a government overspending, or it spends too little and there's unemployment. And the government generally go, well, unemployment doesn't matter how big it gets. Governments don't lose their jobs over that. Inflation, that's what gets, that's what makes politicians lose their jobs. So, they are more concerned with inflation than they are with unemployment. So they always err on spending too little, or making sure there's too little spending power in the economy to give everybody a job. So let's go back to Warren Mosley's analogy with the business cards. Say he's got a classroom of 50 people. and he spends 50 and he taxes 50, and there's 50 hours of work done cleaning the floor, then he's got a clean floor, everybody's got a job, no problem. If he the tax on the whole economy is 40, if the tax on the whole economy is 50 and he only spends 40 because he only needs 40 hours work, you've got unemployment. You're now going to have people looking for work that pays on his business cards that can't find it because he hasn't spent enough. And so he's got two choices at that point. He can lower taxes down to 40, which would be rational, and then the unemployment would go away. Or, he could then spend an extra 10 on something else. I don't know, maybe the windows need cleaning or something like that. And so that's a very basic model of how it works. But, countries are a bit more complicated, and it is impossible to target a precise number of pounds that is going to deliver full employment without accelerating inflation. So what they do is they say to the central bank, target an interest rate, make sure you don't create inflation, and that's it. So they sit around thinking, all right, how much unemployment can we get the population to live with? They adjust the interest rates up and down, and they think, and it's called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, the NIRU. And it's built in to their plan of like, okay, well, how many million people or how many hundreds of thousands of people are we going to leave in this precarious situation? And it's not just the unemployed themselves, it's the people on the edge of unemployment or in the gig economy and things like that. We've all got this precarious existence because this is the way they do things. They have to ensure some level of unemployment to fight inflation. So they use unemployment to fight inflation. And that's it. You've only got that choice. When you're the monopoly issuer, you need a buffer stock policy to stabilize the value of your currency. So, gold is a gold buffer stock policy. A gold standard is a gold buffer stock policy. But what we use is human beings. We go, right, it's a human being buffer stock policy. So we move people in and out of this pool of unemployed labor, people having a miserable life, and we pay them just enough so they don't die. Some of them do, but they're hoping not everybody will die, because if everybody that doesn't have a job just dies, then we'll be at full employment and we'll get inflation. What MMT is saying is, well, what if that buffer stock was an employed buffer stock? And we're not saying that all those people who go on the dole, now you've got to work to get your dole. The dole is still there, but we're saying we're going to offer everybody that's in that pool a job that pays a socially inclusive wage with the kind of benefits that you would imagine in a civilized society, or however civilized you want your society to be. Maybe it's, 2, 3, 4 weeks holiday, maybe it's maternity leave, whatever. This becomes the benchmark job below which no private sector employer can go in terms of like pay and conditions. So it puts a floor under the standard of living, and also
it sets a cost of labor.
And also, exactly. It anchors the value of the currency to the most crucial input, which is like human time and endeavor. I've also thought a way I've heard it described that makes it really compelling is to think of, being on universal credit is the job guarantee right now. It is a job, the government will guarantee you this job. You can organize your own workload, but your job is to not get a job, have a miserable life, try and live off what they're giving you. And, wait for a private sector employer to come along and think
and fight inflation.
Exactly. Sit at home fighting inflation and wait for a private sector employer to offer you like 1 penny more than you're having, than you're getting in now. It really favors the private sector employer who, thrives on a precarious, the precariat as they're called. And
if there's a job guarantee in place, you can just say, stuff working at the Amazon warehouse where you won't even come and check if I've had a heart attack or not, and you put an ankle tag on me and see what's going on. I'm going to go and work at the the universal jobs guarantee job, which I happen to know is better than
But
this.
I always like to lean into I absolutely agree with you. But I always like to lean into the macro of it and go, you've only got two choices with a fiat currency, which is what we've got, and that you don't get an NHS without a fiat currency. You don't get collectively provisioned things like that. And there's only two choices: an unemployed buffer stock or an employed buffer stock. Anything that's not guaranteeing guaranteeing a right to work is accepting an unemployed buffer stock, and that's the way we do it now. And that obviously the MMT economists think, well, it just makes way more sense to have that buffer stock be an employed buffer stock.
The other thing about the job guarantee is that, going back to the subject of inflation, is that as the economy contracts, say if there is a reduction in private sector activity, then naturally the job guarantee would expand, increasing government spending and kind of stabilizing the whole economy, and vice versa. If there's a boom in private activity and people are investing a lot, and then the pool of people who are in a job guarantee job, they would be hired by private sector employers, and then that would naturally reduce government spending. So again, you have a stabilizing effect. So for MMT, the job guarantee becomes what is the equivalent of like what the Phillips curve was for neoclassical economics. Is the mechanism which underpins, which ensures a level of stability within the economy, and on top of that, you have government spending and private spending.
It's like a big it's like a big lever that the government can pull in different directions by, for example, setting the wage or changing what the universal job guarantee people are doing, to change the levels of inflation and so on that you have in the economy.
Well, I think that the big idea behind the job guarantee, and quite an important aspect of it, is that the involvement of the central government really ends at funding it, and what the jobs that actually get done in the job guarantee, that they get decided by locally. So it's centrally funded and locally administered. And that idea is important because it's important as well that none of the jobs are in the private sector. So these are not for-profit jobs, because then you have the benefit is twofold. Then you have obviously the better income for the people who are taking the jobs, the retention of skills, the participatory outcomes of it. But you also have the kind of the benefit that the job itself is providing to the local economy. And it then gives communities the ability to maybe identify issues that are not easily identified centrally, and to maybe try to address issues or experiment with different ways of addressing them at local level, and see and it gives basically, I like to think that it gives communities a certain degree of economic autonomy, and kind of running their economies to some degree, to a much higher degree than they do now. And this idea that then the people who are undertaking the jobs are the ones who are deciding what those jobs are is one of the things that kind of ensures that those jobs are of a certain quality and well remunerated.
Also, just in case there's people who are kind of more to the center or center right listening, the private sector employers prefer to employ people who are already working over people who have been unemployed or long-term unemployed. So Warren Mosler, again, the founder of MMT, talks about the job guarantee. He calls it a transition job because he thinks that's a bit more descriptive, depending on your audience. It's also been known as the employer of last resort as well, and it's got a long history. It goes back to the civil rights movement. It goes back to the New Deal era as well. So it's not a new demand that people are making on governments, but Yeah, so you have these things called bottlenecks, labor bottlenecks. So when the economy picks up, you might still get inflation because this buffer stock of humans that have been at home losing skills, and all kinds of skills. The soft skills of the stuff that you learn that you don't even know you're learning when you're coming in and showing up for work every day, social stuff.
And also, if I can say, just getting depressed in many cases as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that there are terrible links for people's long-term health and long-term unemployment. It's a sort of waste of human potential in more ways than one. For the person themselves, many of us have that dependence on work and a sense of purpose that I'm sure a lot of people listening will know from their own life experience
that's exactly where my political conscience is at too. I agree with everything that you're saying, and I know why I think it's a good idea. But I think we're always talking to people who are like, skeptical about it because they're a bit more, they've drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid, and I'm just saying that that this is a fact that private sector employers prefer to hire people who are already working. So when the economy picks up, you might get a bit of inflation because the people who, like you say, are having this miserable life, getting depressed, losing their skills, losing their socialization and stuff, they're not as liquid, they're not as quick to get back into work as they would be if they were working in a job guarantee job doing something. So the idea is it's there to help people transition back into the private sector when the private sector picks up again, or the government sector. But I say private sector because we're presuming that the government sector is the size it wants to be. The government sector understands it, its spending capacity, and has decided, right, that's it. We've spent what we're going to spend. And then the other thing I wanted to just weigh in on is that the job guarantee wage is a fixed wage, so that if the economy and that's how it anchors the value of the currency. So if it obviously, when the private sector wants to bid people away from the job guarantee buffer stock of people, if the job guarantee wage goes up and tries to compete with them, the private sector to bring them back into the job guarantee, you're going to get into that bidding war, and that will create inflation. So the idea is it's a fixed wage to stabilize the economy, and that's kind of how we do it now. Where if you lose your job, or let's say there's a downturn, forget coronavirus, but let's say there's an economic downturn, people lose their jobs, so they stop paying income tax and they start claiming unemployment benefits. So the government are receiving less and paying out more automatically because of the way we do it now, and that's called the automatic stabilizers. So the government deficit goes up automatically to give the economy a soft landing. So what we're saying is that automatic stabilizer that happens when people lose private sector employment, this is a better buffer stock. The wages are paid higher than what the dole is, and it's going to make that business cycle a lot less traumatic. There's this idea of the NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Well, this job guarantee thing is about a NAIBUR, which is non-accelerating inflation buffer rate of of employment. Sorry, and the idea is that the NAIRU is you have to keep 5%, something like 5%. Maybe if people are feeling crazy,
they change it depending on the weather.
4% of people in this buffer stock having a miserable life. The MMTists have worked out actually you could probably have it 3%, 2% of people in the NAIBUR because it's a much more liquid buffer stock. So the people in it are going to be a lot fewer as well. So it complements the private sector.
So we've sort of addressed an imaginary member of the audience who's more to the right wing of us, and I think we sort of have acknowledged that we're all probably left of centre politically here. I know that there are people like this in my audience, and I always say to them, if you disagree with anything that you hear on the show or that anything that I say, please get in touch, and I'd like to explain it to you. We had an episode that we did on universal basic income. Explain why I believe it anyway. I don't know whether I'll be able to persuade everyone of my point of view always, but we had an episode on universal basic income, and one of the listeners got in touch and said, I don't approve of all of this, government taxing people and redistributing wealth for doing nothing. And from this perspective, I think that actually the universal jobs guarantee that is proposed by MMT as the solution to a lot of these problems is a lot more attractive because it contains within it this idea that the government is not giving you money for doing nothing per se. Instead, the government is giving you a social contract, a literal social contract in the form of an employment contract, saying, if you do this work, you will be guaranteed this minimum standard at the job, and you'll be guaranteed this minimum standard of life. And I wonder if, in that sense, it's not. I mean, the critics of MMT, and I'm sure you guys have heard this lots, will call it magic money tree and say it's all about printing as much money as possible to pay for all sorts of wonderful things. The sort of the idealized vision that I have of it when it sort of works out is that the cornerstones of a government that's run in a way that's informed by MMT is to reassess the economy. Forget budgets, forget deficits, forget interest rates and things. As a monetarily sovereign government that prints its own money, these are sort of arbitrary constraints that you're setting on yourself. And simply say this instead. If we have unemployed people who want to work but can't, and we have socially useful work that needs to be done, the economy is not functioning optimally. And you can't expect the private sector, which is obviously incentivized by the profit motive, to come along and fix that deficit by itself. It won't do that. But what we actually have in the real economy, forgetting the world of money completely, is real resources in the form of these people that are being wasted and real problems that need solving. And when the private sector can't allocate those resources to the appropriate problems, the state should step in and do what it takes to make that happen. And that's the sort of social contract that I think we would want to establish. And of course, you can say whether you agree with that or not. And of course, we all know that we do have these problems, whether it's caring for the elderly, which is a huge issue in the country at the moment, dealing with mental health issues, that's another big issue. Addressing climate change, of course, would be my bugbear as a physicist who looks into this. We know that there's lots of physical things that need to be done. We need to install renewables. We need to install energy efficiency measures. We need to work on this green transition, And this is the sort of thing where not only a universal jobs guarantee, but also removing some of these kind of quite arbitrary fiscal and these arbitrary fiscal barriers of budgets and deficits, which aren't focusing on inflation, which is the only thing we really need to worry about, would help us to do. So that's my rant. But I think from the perspective saying that MMT is not necessarily a left-wing theory, and it's not, nor is it a theory that one can simply print as much money as one wants to pay for whatever one wants to do. But instead, it's just changing what you view as the things that are important to control in the economy, the nature of a functioning economy that is working well, and the role of the state in guaranteeing that.
Absolutely. I mean, UBI is a very big subject, and there are various things that I personally don't like about it. But you outline it perfectly in the sense that one of the big differences between UBI and the job guarantee is that there are two sides to what makes up for the well-being of a society and for the well-being of an employee or a worker. And one of them is to have sufficient, income to buy the things that they need to live and to live, not just survive, but live happy lives. And the other hand is to make sure that the goods are out there and the services are out there for those people to enjoy and to actually purchase with these money or to be provisioned to them on a kind of a universal sense. So I've always felt that UBI only takes care of one of those sides. And by ignoring the other side of the equation, which is production, how do you organize the economy? And the economy really are the workers. How do you organize the workers towards a common purpose? And of course, you need to provide incomes, but also you need to ensure that those services are out there. So the job guarantee addresses that a lot better, I think. The other aspect as well is, as you say, the UBI can be a lot more divisive than the job guarantee. This idea that people could, if they wanted to, simply opt out of the social contract and still enjoy all the benefits that everybody else does. This is something that will grate on a lot of people, and something that actually benefit claimants have unfairly been demonized for the last few decades. If you see all the Daily Mail and many of the newspapers, the tabloids, and the job guarantee gives people a claim over production, and it kind of meets the worker where they are, and it says, regardless of where you are, of your skill, we're going to give you something that is going to be useful for society, and also that is going to be good quality employment, that is going to give you at the same time income, and is going to so that nobody's surplus, right? Nobody's a burden on everybody else. No, there's this sense that really we're all in this together. And that's why in poll after poll, the job guarantee has always come on top of UBI. And if you see the polls, I think there was one on YouGov not so long ago, you see that the support for job guarantee tends to be higher in. There is no single demographic where the UBI beats the job guarantee. Across classes, across cities, across every age, everything you can think of, even political affiliation, a job guarantee is always perceived as fairer. And because of that, I think it's more conducive to a cohesive society. I understand as well kind of the some of the sentiment behind UBI. I understand that a lot of people, what they feel is that, they've had crushing jobs for a very long time, and capitalists have, really taking the piss, forgive my French, but with the level of employment, the incomes, but also the quality of employment that people have been given. And I think that there is perhaps a natural kind of rejection of the very concept of work, not least because they see the Tory government kind of weaponizing the idea of work against them. There is this section of, well, if you're poor, it's because you're not working enough, and we know that's not true. And but they say it like that, and they keep repeating, work will be your way out of poverty, keep doing it, and it just never happens. So they feel disillusioned with the whole system, and they want a way to just simply opt out of it. And I kind of empathize with that, but I would suggest that a better approach would be to actually demand that, not simply opt out of work, but demand that work is better. And a big important aspect of that is bringing government back in the equation, and making sure that the capitalist, the private sector is not the only source of employment.
Because I think people go, oh, people, UBI is sexy. What, you're just going to give me money to live on? Great. It's not hard to sell. And then the perception is you've got these people like the MMT people coming in and going, no, you're not allowed to have a UBI, you must work and work. And obviously, I don't like to pit one against the other, because, that's really not what's going on. So I'll say it like this. If we go back to that Warren Mosler business card analogy, Warren holds up the business card and he goes, I need 50 hours of work. I'm going to spend 50 of these, right? I am, why did I do this to start with? Is it because I'm just mean and I am trying to just get you to clean the floor? And now I'm going to kind of add my own analogy in it. If this is a democratic government, you voted for a clean floor. So you gave me the permission to do this, right? So now I've got to move resources from the private sector into public sector use. And we do that with a money system. Warren says in the old days, you'd wake up how do the governments used to provision themselves? One way you could do it, you could conquer somewhere and take slaves, and they do all the work. Or you could be out drinking one night and wake up with a lump in your head and you're on a boat and now you're in the British Navy. That's how states have provisioned themselves historically. We pretend to be a bit more civilized, and we use this money system where we go, okay, we need so much doing, so we then impose a tax. So the first thing that happens is, in the order of operations, is you've got a government that desires to provision itself. It wants roads and soldiers and police and libraries and an NHS and a school system. And how's it going to move resources from private sector use, where everybody is to start with, into public sector? And it does this thing where it demands taxes paid in a token that only it's allowed to issue, and with strong penalties for counterfeiting. And now it can pay you to do the things it wants you to do. And let's pretend we're living in some semblance of a democracy and it's a happy story. We voted for these things. We wanted schools and libraries and stuff. So now, we're happy to pay our taxes, not because it's funding the spending, but because it's the mechanism by which government provisions itself, right? So if you in the first instance, when you lay on the tax, you've made the entire population unemployed by definition. There are people now looking to work for the thing that you issue, and they haven't got it yet. Now they're unemployed, and then you spend the money and they become employed. But you don't spend enough. That's what unemployment is. You don't, or you tax too much out. So there's not enough spending power in the economy to give everybody a job. It's on the government to fix that. The government started it. Yeah. So in terms of like morality, or should the nanny state come in and bolster the private sector and interfere? It's like the interference started at the beginning. The interference started with, you wanted things doing collectively, like an NHS. So now we have to have a money system. That's how we move resources around. And so, Warren calls it the base case for analysis. Presumably I did this because I wanted to give everybody a job. It would be irrational for me not to give everybody a job, given that this is how we do things. So, that it kind of, I think that there's a strong moral case for everybody, who wants a job. Don't forget, the job guarantee is not a demand that everybody goes to work. It's just an offer of work. You can choose to be unemployed if you want. So it's, it's there to target involuntary unemployment. So, it kind of gets around the morality of it. It's like, the government is responding. It's not like you said, it's not the response. It's not on the private sector for not spending more money in a recession or taking out bigger loans. It's now, the private sector's spent what it wants to spend, and now there's still unemployment. So that, it is on the government to step up, because it's the only, for starters, it's responsible for unemployment in the first instance. So, it needs to fix its mistake. And then, so if we go back to that analogy and you tax 50, and you spend, and then you can hire people because people now need the money to pay the tax. Well, what if you just give them the money without working, which is what UBI is? Well, how are you, you know what I mean? How are you going to create a demand? Exactly. So, that's one very simple thing about UBI. It's like, you're just basically giving them the money to pay the tax, and it defeats the whole purpose of the exercise. So there's that. And then, but, let's just put that to one side. I know that there's not just one UBI plan out there, but let's assume that when everybody talks about UBI, they mean universal, right? So the one thing that unites all these UBI plans is it's universal. So there's definitely two types of people in an economy. There are people who don't have enough money to live on, and if they can earn it or you give it to them, they'll spend it. And there are people who not only have they had all their needs catered for, they're actually piling money up. And we know this group exists because they're constantly looking for places to shift their money to be tax efficient, or maybe they're trying to invest it so that they can either beat inflation or actually, just make money off of investment. So, there's definitely these two groups of people. So if let's take a modest UBI plan, like, I think Andrew Yang's was, $1,000 a month or something. Let's say it's £1,000 a month. It's 12 grand a year. Okay. You take over a 10-year timeline, you've got the person who needed it to live on spending it all. So that their wealth has not gone up. They haven't died, but their wealth has not gone up. The person who's got more money and owns several properties and investment properties, you've just given them 240 grand over 10 years. And don't forget, UBI is a permanent program. So you've got the people on the lower echelon who are no richer, and then the people who are already quite rich, you've now given them £250,000 over 10 years. You've given them a house or two houses, basically. I really hope anybody that's thinking about UBI can see what I'm saying here, that there's no way that's not going to deepen wealth inequality. Yeah, it's going to stop the person that spends the UBI from dying, but at the top end, it's just going to completely widen the wealth gap of the have-nots and the have-yots.
On that note as well, if you think about it, and this is a hypothetical UBI where there is no job guarantee present, you can give people an income, but you're not really creating jobs. And the levels of UBI that have been proposed have been nowhere near what anybody might need to live a dignified life. So it's very likely that you still get people who are on UBI and who are still desperate for employment, and who therefore the employers or the private sector still have the upper hand as sole providers of employment. But then you have people who have some income, so they're really just looking for a little bit more in order to make ends meet. So in that way, the UBI might work as a kind of a wage subsidy, in much the same way that the furloughing income is doing, and simply allow employers to pay their employees less, while extracting profit from them, and that as well might contribute to further inequality, as they get to keep a bigger share of the pie.
Hopefully people could see that it deepens wealth inequality. And often when you start picking holes in the plan, like we just have, then people start going, well, maybe, it's a universal thing, but it gets clawed back through taxes and stuff like that. So that at the very top end, they don't get it. And then it's like, well, great. Well, now we're talking about basic income. We're talking about de facto basic income, not universal basic income. So it's the U in UBI that people who kind of get the macro consequences are bothered about, but in no way do we want to get in the way of the government giving people money to survive, or even, God forbid, have a better life. But it's the fact that, when you give it to people who are just able to invest it, think about giving people, people who've got investments all over the place and are not living hand to mouth, £250,000 over 10 years. That there's this kind of straw man thing that people chuck at MMTs, which is, it's just print money, spend on whatever you want. And really, I like to remind people that only policy prescription in MMT is the job guarantee. We are just proposing that, everything else is descriptive. So we're going, given that that money comes into being and flows through the economy and exits the economy in this way, we only want to spend money to enhance people's lives. And how do we do that? Well, in the Thatcher era, there was this idea of trickle-down economics, of like, if we give it to people who are really, quote unquote, good with money, it will trickle down and eventually everybody will have a job. If you just give out money willy-nilly and, people who are bad with money, then that won't result in any unemployment. And I like the analogy that trickle-down economics is like, you want to fill your bathtub, so you go to the flat upstairs and you fill their bathtub and you wait for it to overflow and you hope that some of it drips into your bathtub. We're saying, the simplest,
just fill the bucket.
Exactly. The simplest route between 2 points is a straight line. We want to eliminate the involuntary unemployment. Just eliminate the involuntary unemployment, and that's how we end up not spending more than the economy needs and creating inflation. We're just buying up what the private sector doesn't want.
Mm-hmm. So there are just a couple of things I point out here. One is to say that, Christian, your objection to UBI is in some ways quite similar to the objection that I believe the Bank of England itself has levied against quantitative easing, which we have talked about in previous episodes of this show, where a lot of the QE money has ultimately gone to people who didn't really need it, or the argument is that it's gone into inflating asset prices, so to speak. And people, have had their government bonds bought back off them, and they've used that money to buy back shares and so on. And so it's caused a detachment, which has now become extreme, between the stock market and the real economy, which is something that we're sort of continuing to see happen at the moment. And then when you look at things from that perspective, you think, well, it's almost a policy that defends the interests of people who have assets, and that is something that the Bank of England itself has also, sort of admitted, and is therefore leading to further inequality in the system. I had a few things I wanted to say about the UBI as well, just quickly, which is, first off, I always think about these things about like how I would sell them to my dad, who is willing to get.
That's a really good tip.
Give us a picture.
Yeah, well, I mean,
which newspaper does your dad read, and then we'll know.
I couldn't possibly speculate. What I will say is that he does work extraordinarily hard, and has done so for his whole life, and therefore is exercised about the nature of the taxes that are being spent. And I think every taxpayer should be also as well. But I think it would be, much easier to sell the more centrist concept of a jobs guarantee, where you can see the nature of the social contract in putting something back in versus a UBI. Now, with respect to the UBI, the other thing I would say is that the guy we interviewed on it, Stuart Lansley, who does work for Compass and so on, his version of the UBI was not quite a case of giving everyone an equal amount of money, because you balance it out by tax changes, and the whole thing is demonstrated on the UK economy to make it progressive rather than regressive. So in a sense, it's just it's a welfare state where you allow people to choose what they'll spend their money on because they know best what it is that they need. And I think that's a slightly separate argument to the type of UBI that a lot of people envision, which is a sort of UBI where, there's an automation apocalypse and all of the jobs vanish. And this is certainly why people in Silicon Valley seem to love it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm suspicious of it, because I no longer trust that these people have society's best interest in mind. It seems to me like their view of a UBI is that this will be the thing that they can shift onto governments and say, okay, well, it's the government's responsibility to ensure that all of the people who we've made unemployed by replacing them with apps still have money to buy iPhones. And that's like the sort of Silicon Valley perspective on a UBI. And I think that perspective of a UBI relies on you taking into account this idea that the automation is going to come and steal all the jobs, which I know is not something that a lot of people agree with. And, I think that's another 2 hours that we could talk about, to be honest, until the cows come home. But I think it's just interesting to point out that, of course, the UBI means so many different things to so many different people, depending on the level you set it at and what other sorts of benefits that it replaces and so on. And I think that it's too easy to sort of caricature and pigeonhole all of those into individual into, I guess, policy prescriptions that aren't really what the people involved are saying. So I would say that, from my perspective anyway, there's types of UBI where it takes on a redistributive role, a bit like Milton Friedman's negative income tax or something like that, which is something that he had proposed at one point. That makes sense to me.
I was going to say, actually,
sorry.
Milton Friedman offered that, didn't he? But didn't he speak as well about I believe it was Milton Friedman who spoke about kind of creating a society of elite producers and basically an underclass of consumers.
That's the society that I think a lot of people are interested in creating, or that a lot of people feel that we're headed towards, or, wouldn't mind us heading towards, because they think they'll be on one side of it. And I think the advantage of the universal jobs guarantee is that, people will say that a UBI has dignity at its core because everyone has what's necessary to survive, but you could make the same claim for a universal jobs guarantee, if it's done properly. And one of the other things I did want to talk about as well is, that we have mentioned already David Graeber, of course, who recently died an untimely death at the age of 59. And this show, for listeners, is going to do a tribute episode to him, because it was reading his essay and then his book on bullshit jobs that I think is something that more people should be aware of. And I won't spike that, but in short, one of the questions that bullshit jobs is trying to answer is, if the private sector is so efficient at creating meaningful, important employment for everyone, how come most people think their jobs are bullshit and can't see the social value of them? I come back to the coronavirus crisis again, because I think that, as you guys both said, the 2008-9 financial crisis was a moment of economic interest in economics awakening for you. I was sort of 14 or 15 at the time, so I wasn't really paying that much attention to it. But I think this coronavirus crisis is going to be the next thing for a new generation of people to start thinking about how the economy works and whether the picture that they have of it is correct, as people can see, and also just the sanity of the things that are going on. So, I mean, the classic example here that we have in the UK at the moment that's come up recently is the government was encouraging a lot of people to go back to the offices, and the sort of popular idea is that this is motivated because the retail sandwich industry in the UK, pret-a-manger and chains like this, will go bankrupt if no one is there to eat sandwiches at this restaurant. And it sort of shows that there is I think candidly, we would probably all agree that it's more to do with the fact that if no one ever goes back to the offices again, now that people have discovered that many of their jobs can be done from home, it may prevent the ability of landlords in the cities to collect as much rent as they used to on the properties that they own.
Yep.
And that's more what they're concerned about. And that it is more politically palatable to say that you're trying to save the job of the poor old sandwich maker in Pret, because that's a more politically relatable
Yes.
person. But we now have this ludicrous system whereby there's been a big shock to the economy. Everything has changed. The private sector is inflexible. The neoclassical model of economics, where people can just run around from one job to another seamlessly and they're always being employed by a perfect private sector, is evidently wrong. There's masses of socially useful work that we need people to be doing in various different fields, climate change, but also pandemic response, where it would be really useful to have a big workforce that we could rely on for that. It's a deflationary crisis, so people are spending less because they don't have the money, and therefore the government actually has leeway to spend more. I was going to say print money, but the government has leeway to spend more to counteract the deflation. And you just see how much better a world where we weren't all subscribing to this dogma that only the private sector can employ people to do socially useful things and that it should dominate above all things, because the reality is that it's useful for some things and not useful for others. And this crisis, I think, is illustrating a lot of the flaws in that. And I think that people will see the absurdity of their government kind of spending lots of money to encourage people to go and buy sandwiches in Pret and so on when they no longer want to buy sandwiches in Pret, as evidence of the fact that there have to be sort of better ways, and the universal jobs guarantee being one that I think a lot of people could agree has merit, to direct our labour and our economic activity away from the type of jobs that David Graeber would call bullshit and towards the kind of work that people would find a lot more satisfying, because they can wake up in the morning and think, well, at least I know why I'm doing this. So yeah, that is a rant again. But I just think
I loved it.
Yeah, I loved it too. I think we were talking about this yesterday, weren't we, Christian? And I think that David Graeber is being proven right at the moment, because basically we've discovered that during the crisis, and let's keep in mind that this has unprecedented, just to use that word that has been going around a lot, and nobody really knew what was going to happen. There were some fears that there might be inflation, because if you keep too many workers at home, then things don't get produced, and then there may be shortages, and therefore leading to inflation. Are we going to have enough food? What if farmers get ill, etc.? And if anything, this crisis has shown that there's an awful lot of things that really were not really missing out there. A lot of jobs that are pretty bullshit, like David would say. And yet the essentials, or what is, things that we have, food and access to basic services, all that are some of the most undervalued jobs in the whole economy. And it just goes to show just how upside down things are, how overpaid things that we don't need or we don't miss are, and how underpaid things that we cannot live without are. And if anything, this is a time when the government has to step in and say, okay, well, what if we offered Pret employees a job guarantee, paying more than they ever were paid by Pret? They're not saying that. What they are nervous about is that the whole crisis will cause more people to demand more government intervention. So they're eager to go back to things as they were, to keep the illusion that the market is all that we have, and the market is the best means of allocating resources. So they don't want to provide us with too many things that we like, because they are concerned that we are going to, that their game is going to be up, and that once you give something, you're not going to be able to take it away. So I think this crisis, if anything, is a great opportunity to incorporate something as a job guarantee and demand that, and say the government can do more. It's not just the market that we
And we make podcasts, we listen to podcasts. One thing I've noticed listening to podcasts recently is the number of government advertisements that you get in the UK. And apologies again if this is UK centric. People around the world will know that your own governments, if they're monetarily sovereign, have this sort of set of decisions facing them that they can deal with. The adverts until very recently were saying back to normal. Let's get back to normal. We're all going to go back to normal. Let's all just pretend that
normal
it didn't
was
happen.
awful.
And if you look at the YouGov surveys that have been done of people, there's 97% of people. There's ridiculous consensus that we don't get for virtually anything in this country. People saying that they don't want to go back to normal because they see there were flaws with the old system, and the sort of the lack of imagination and compassion and sort of willingness to think big in solution to the crisis, because we all remember the Great Depression required big thinking to get out of it on the part of FDR, and he's now well known, well considered to be one of the better presidents that the United States had, and all this sort of thing. And I think we know that people don't want to go back to normal. We know that what was normal wasn't necessarily working. We know that there's plenty of socially useful jobs that people could be doing. We know that money is not a constraint for the government in the way that people thought it was, providing inflation is under control. And you're sort of left thinking, once all of this information is out there and once people have this perspective on what's going on, it's the sort of thing that is going to build pressure for people to say, well, what's your solution to this beyond everyone going back to work in prep? Because this disruption could also, and this crisis could also be an opportunity, as many people have said. And we know, of course, that there are people who will view a crisis as an opportunity from a sort of disaster capitalism sense, as in we can come in and use the fact that we have capital and access to resources and so on to manipulate this crisis for our own ends. And we see that happening with some of the sort of stock market excesses and the profiteering that's happened during this pandemic, which I think has been pretty revolting in certain places to see. But we also know that a crisis can be an opportunity in the sense of there's all this dislocation. A lot of people have lost jobs that it turns out were not pivotal or useful, and that they may not have been enjoying. And we know that there's all these problems to solve in terms of NHS, social care, mental health, cleaning litter off the streets, and the combating climate change, which is going to be the work of this century. And it seems very lacking in imagination that people aren't looking to view this as more of an opportunity to solve those problems, and instead want to return to a status quo that wasn't working for a lot of people, as we've seen with Brexit and Trump and so on, and the democratic convulsions that have been gripping societies on either side of the Atlantic for the last 5 years. One thing you can say about those big votes is that it demonstrated that the status quo wasn't working for a lot of people, and they don't want to go back.
Yeah. You just put me in mind of one of our favourite guests that we have on the MMT podcast, John Harvey from Texas. He's born in Britain, but you're not supposed to tell people that because he's very Texan. But he has he's really funny. He's just great to chat to. But he has this thing where he goes, look, if you've got a social problem, there's a job on the other end of that. So that should cut through the whole, there's nothing to do. The robots have taken all our jobs. The way I've heard it described is, a few hundred years ago, it needed like 95% of us growing food, otherwise we'd starve. Then now we only need like 1 or 2% of humanity growing food to feed all of us. And then everybody was in manufacturing, and then automation came along, and we went from 70% of people in manufacturing jobs down to 8 or 9%. And we've got all the gizmos we need because of automation. And that's how come we've got a service economy. That's how come we're able to have doctors and lawyers and an NHS and so, because we're not out there, operating spinning jennies and stuff like that, or growing food. So automation's an increased productivity story, as Warren Mosler talks about it. It doesn't necessarily have to lead to unemployment. It's the government response because capitalism is disruptive. Let's take out automation. Capitalism is incentivizing people to lay people off. If you can get the same productivity out of, for like half the workforce, you're going to do it. You're incentivized to do that as a business owner, or that business gets more efficient. But then when half the workforce gets fired, the economy as a whole gets a lot more inefficient because the government doesn't take up that slack for the people who want a job. And again, that's why the job guarantee is there, to fix that problem. It's John Harvey calls it the fundamental flaw in capitalism, which is that labor is a cost to business and it's a cost to be minimized. So it's going to happen every time. So the kind of automation we're looking at now, it's not new. It's been with us since, water mills. If you let private sector employers define what a job is, then you've got this thing where, okay, only anything that makes a profit, that's the only time the private sector hires. That's the only time capital hires, when they can make a profit. And, the NHS wouldn't be there if,
Mm-hmm.
do you know what I mean? If we defined, everything that's not that, is not a job. It's not a worthwhile job because there's no profit in it. We wouldn't have an NHS. And I always bang on about the NHS because I think even right of centre people are, there's a way high approval rating for the NHS. So,
or the standing army, you wouldn't have one of those either.
Yeah. But I just think I think in this country, compared to say the States, where they still have to make the case that healthcare is a human right and stuff, they're still working on public opinion. Our public opinion's pretty well aligned that no, this is how we want to do it. This is the rational way to do healthcare. So that's why I always use the NHS.
I like to make a distinction of what the market, in theory, market is the best at allocating resources, but I actually think the market is good at providing our immediate wants, right? You want this right now, somebody's out there can make a profit, they'll sell it to you. But it's not very good at giving us what we need necessarily, and it's not very good at thinking long term. So as a result of that, we are seeing, if we over rely on the market to provide for us in all aspects of our life, then we're going to have huge degradation of the environment, as we're seeing. So we need that long-term approach, which can only come from communities getting together and actually deciding what is it that we need.
I sort of have the Rolling Stones playing in my head now, or is it the Rolling Stones?
What's that? You can't always get what you
want. But sometimes you can get what
Maybe you should put that at the beginning of the podcast.
And get done by the copyright people. I don't know about that. No, it is a good point you make, though. And I mean, I come at this from a perspective of climate science and climate politics that I'm intimately involved with. And, one aspect of this that is the case is that there are certain sectors that we will not be able to decarbonize in a market efficient way, because it sort of comes down to the point of you are effectively having to clean up your rubbish that you're dumping into the atmosphere. And if it's not going to be possible to make it cheaper to do things the clean way, then you just have to insist that people clean up their rubbish. And yet our insistence in making sure that everything can exist in a framework where profit is the only incentive that we consider and markets are the only thing we allow to deliver things means that you end up with people trying to make a case for how a business that just disposes of waste can be profitable. And, unless people are willing to pay you the right amount of money to dispose of your waste, then it won't be. And that would be something like a carbon tax, I suppose, and that's one way you could get around it. But then governments don't implement that. And so you think, well, you can't have things existing in this purely market-based structure if you want to solve some of these social problems, because you're not putting the proper. I mean, I suppose someone who is in favour of markets would say you're not putting the proper prices and incentives on different things, because, as we all know, we don't live in a world where everyone has perfect information and perfect access to what they value.
You brought up the carbon tax there. It just made me think about something that Randall Ray said when we had him on, which is that is the problem with the whole idea of the taxes are collected in and then the government spends them out again. People then go, okay, so we're going to tax things that we think are bad, and then that'll fund the cleanup effort or something like that. And he's going, look, a carbon a carbon tax that actually generates income has failed because people are putting carbon into the atmosphere. If your spending plans hinge on people paying to pollute, they're going to pollute, and you need them to pollute to get the income to then spend. So, if you don't want carbon in the atmosphere, outlaw it. Don't tax it, and he goes, look, the market got us into this mess. It's not going to be the solution.
Yeah, you don't want to make the good dependent on the bad, basically. And another thing I might mention is that as an engineer, I worked in a sustainability team, and I've seen over the years people make the case of how do we get industry to care more about the climate, right? How do we get greener buildings without regulation? How do we get developers to invest in green technology? And it's, I can tell you, it's been decades of trying to persuade or find arguments that are based on, if you're green, you're going to make more profit because you're going to get more buyers interested. And I tell you, it's a losing battle. If it is successful, it's very rarely so, and it's not something that can make substantial change, because the bottom line is always what matters. The profit is what comes first.
One thing that I think is interesting about MMT is that the caricature is that it's a sort of lefty excuse to print money and fund things that we can't afford. But when you get into it, there are aspects of MMT that contradict a lot of liberal or left-wing values about several different things. So, this is sort of interesting coming from your show. I mean, one example is the importance of monetary sovereignty and being able to print your own currency for controlling your economy. So, MMT per se might not really take a position on Brexit. We probably have our own feelings about it, the departure of the UK from the European Union. But it would view the EU as problematic for a lot of countries in there, because the EU has a single currency, and therefore it's harder for them to, each government isn't individually monetarily sovereign. And so it's sort of harder for them to agree on what they should do to get full employment across the different economies when they all function differently. I mean, do you think that's a fair comment on the sort of the importance of the monetary sovereignty? Because there'll be people listening to this all over the world, and some of whom will say, well, hang on, my government doesn't function like this. It doesn't print its own currency. So what would we sort of say to that?
I think MMT, well, first of all, MMT in itself doesn't have a position on the EU or on Brexit, because and within the MMT community, you won't find necessarily kind of the same opinion from person to person. It's just that I guess the kind of understanding of monetary sovereignty and the kind of the role that government plays, and the importance of being able to issue your own currency, but most of all for that issuing of currency to be under democratic control, it becomes, I guess, naturally a priority for a lot of the activists who are involved in spreading MMT. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there are libertarians that for some reason as well have started their own kind of MMT narratives, but I don't think they fly very well generally. But most of the MMT supporters you'll find will be on the left and will be critical, at the very least, of EU positions, and primarily of the Eurozone for that basis. But I mean, these are political positions. If you don't consider these democratic issues to be so important, then you might not mind so much. And there are certainly MMTers who are pro-EU and even pro-Euro. So, and who may have different ideas as to how to fix the Eurozone. And but I think personally, about the left, I would say that there is a lot of misconceptions about how the Eurozone works. And I think that an understanding of MMT would certainly help kind of make a lot of these issues more transparent. Not so that people agree, but that simply people understand the true kind of dynamics within it. And you can apply that as well to other parts of the world and relationships within countries. For example, you can understand then what Puerto Rico not having its own currency does to Puerto Rico, or what Ecuador's decision to use the dollar and not its own currency does to Ecuador, or or similarly, the relationship within African countries and the EU itself, you then are able to see how these power dynamics work and how some relationships are more extractive, and certainly how modern, in certain aspects, how modern colonialism works, and not to say the least in the influence of America and the dominance of the dollar in the world. All those things, if looked through an MMT lens, they can help you understand a lot of the issues, and certainly help kind of map a route forward for a lot of countries. And I think that's why movements have spanned all over Europe, about ways forward informed by MMT, but also in Africa and also in Latin America, and we're seeing small groups kind of grow in India as well, grow and start demanding that for campaigning for key policies, all informed under an MMT lens.
And so the point we would be making here is that lots of these governments, for example, in Africa, aren't monetarily sovereign and depend instead on the dollar. And therefore, if controlling the supply of dollars, which is what the Federal Reserve does, and gets a lot of stick for, is the thing to do, then that's being done in the interests of the American economy and not in the interests of these developing nation economies, who also hold debts denoted in dollars as well, which has caused them a lot of problems in the past.
Yeah. So I personally had no idea, why it mattered what currency a country borrowed in, whether it was dollars or their own local currency. I didn't know what difference it made. And by the looks of it, a lot of people don't know it, because, Theresa May a while back, it was attacking Jeremy Corbyn on the Prime Minister's questions, talking about the importance of decreasing the deficit. And she gave as an example Greece. She said, Greece shows what happens if you don't decrease the deficit. We all know what happens. And obviously it's a dumb comparison. Greece's economy is nothing like ours. We issue our own currency and Greece doesn't. But she is relying, if she doesn't know it herself, which I presume she knows the difference, and by the looks on Jeremy Corbyn's face, I assume he did as well. But let's say that she does. She's still relying on a lot of people's ignorance on the matter not to be able to tell what the difference is between those countries. And that is the crucial thing. And once you understand that difference, then you're so much less easily scared by these kind of propositions.
So the way I put it is, when the Eurozone nations went into the euro, they gave up their currency for a foreign currency, all of them. And so now they're currency users instead of currency issuers. And the way I like to understand it is they put themselves in the position of like municipalities here in the UK. Like Islington as a municipality can't create pounds. The central government can, but Islington can't. So Islington can run out of money. It could sell bonds, municipal bonds if it wants, but it could default on those bonds if it doesn't get the money. So in a way, they all became municipalities, but it's kind of worse than that because, at least all the municipalities in England, there's a culture binding us together. We all speak English, and all kinds of things. Whereas, what's going on for the Eurozone nations is they're all very different. They all need different things. And when the euro was proposed, I'm sure it made a lot of sense. It's like, well, we've got one market, let's have one currency. It's going to cut out a lot of faff. But really, if you don't, what you need is, one polity, one currency. Otherwise, you're going to be in all these kind of scrapes where you cannot, you don't actually have actual sovereignty if you don't have monetary sovereignty. You don't get to say how you want to tackle unemployment. And to that point, MMT is, I know we sort of intimated that it's kind of, you're probably going to find more MMTers on the left than on the right. But, say Randall Wray, again, is, he wrote the first MMT scholarly work, Understanding Modern Money. So he's like, one of the primary MMT scholars. He says, look, MMT is consistent with a big government, it's consistent with a small government. And, like I'm sure you've heard many MMT people say, MMT is just a lens. There's a prescriptive part, yes, but for the large part of it, MMT is just a lens. So it lets you understand why stuff is happening and how governments spend and why they are taxing and all that kind of stuff that we've already gone over. And when that sinks in for people, the next thing they go to is, oh my God, we've got to constrain the government. It could run, and there is a constraint. It's called the budgeting process. You vote for a government because it's promised to spend on X, Y, and Z, and it's promised to limit spending on A, B, and C, and that's what's going to happen. That is the check on government spending. Democracy. So when people go, I don't trust the government. I've heard Randall Ray say it. What they're actually saying, whether they know it or not, is we don't trust democracy. So I'm a big believer, and that was one of the things that got me really excited about MMT. Like, this could really, cross the left-right divide. I would much rather be fighting with conservatives that understood MMT about substantive things rather than whether or not the government can or has run out of money. Because once all of us understand how the money system works, then we get to have arguments about, okay, well, what do you think is appropriate for the private sector to decide, the market mechanism to decide, and what do we think? Well, there's no point in it because, I don't know, the national grid, it's a natural monopoly. Public health, it's a natural monopoly. There's no point in bringing, competition is not going to make that service more responsive to the users of the service. And, we can have arguments about that, which I think would be, much more healthy for democracy and politics rather than this, we're spending like a drunken sailor and we're going to become the next Greece. And as Patricia just said, there's no way a monetarily sovereign country can become the next Greece. There is no such thing. Once you understand, the way money works through the MMT lens.
So I want to draw this out a little bit because, I used to try and keep this show a little bit devoid of politics. I think ever since the coronavirus, it's become more difficult to do that because I think it's just, it's so clear to me that lots of the things that, this show has never been completely devoid of politics because we talk about science and we talk about the history of science, and unfortunately history and science are both politicized, as is everything else at the moment. And if people are to care about, for example, climate change, and we had a whole series on existential risks. We did a show on pandemics 3 years ago, talking about the prospects for a pandemic to possibly come along. If people want these things to be sorted out, there's always going to be an element of politics that's important to discuss and how these things intersect with society. But given that this is now a little bit political, I think it's important to piss everyone off equally. So we've talked about how MMT kind of blows up this narrative of the government has run out of money and we can't afford to pay nurses or buy this thing or do a Green New Deal or do funding for the NHS because the government has run out of money. Providing inflation is not a bar and you're willing to live with the inflation that you have now, there's no issue. But of course, the other aspect from this taxes don't fund government spending point is that it blows up some narratives that are popular on the left wing as well.
Yes,
like the idea that we need to tax the rich more to fund the NHS. No, we don't. Yeah. That's a choice.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
That's a choice. And the point is that the taxation in an MMT point of view is serving to give value to the currency. That's the primary purpose. The secondary purpose is to get people to do stuff that the government wants them to do. So, we tax smoking because we think smoking is bad, and we tax alcohol because we think alcohol is bad. And in a society with a public healthcare system, that's a political debate that you can have, whether, this is something that you should do. So there's a sort of, and of course, then there's the redistributive aspect of this. Now, what I would always say to people, if they're concerned about the government using taxation as a mechanism of redistributing things, is that if we continue to live in a society based on economic growth where we allow people to speculate on stocks and so on, if you have $1 million, you can pay yourself 70 grand a year for doing nothing by investing it in the stock market or buying bonds or whatever. The redistributive aspect has got nothing to do with punishing people's success, but just stopping the inevitable nature of a system which will allow the the Gini coefficient to tend towards 1 and have an unbelievably unequal society where, you know, all of the wealth and power accumulates in a very small number of hands. And I think, again, it's about this getting the debate to a more substantive place where you're not saying, well, on one side there's inequality and on the other side there's communism or whatever. It's more a case of what level of inequality are you willing to tolerate? What level of inequality do you think is acceptable? But that becomes a secondary purpose of taxation, and we actually break the rhetorical link in MMT between the purpose of taxation that's trying to fend off inequality or get the people to do things the government wants and incentivize things the government likes and disincentivize the things it doesn't like, and the government provisioning itself. And therefore the tax the rich to fund the NHS is, well, it's just two separate policies. You can also justify deficit-funded tax cuts from an MMT understanding of economics just fine as well.
Yes.
In a sense, you could say that if you think that the best system is for the private sector to employ most people, and I think we talked about why we personally don't think that, but if you do, then you could say that, in a sense, from a right-wing perspective, the rate of tax that the government has is, in a sense, helping to create unemployment by taking too much money out of the private sector. Where I would say that's faulty is that assumes that the private sector will employ everyone if it has enough money, rather than just buying back its own shares, as we've seen it do, or investing that money in technology to automate away jobs. But again, you sort of...
It depends where you
MMT
apply those tax cuts. You know,
MMT as a lens kind of blows up narratives that people like to use on all sides of politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think on the left in particular, I mean, this has been one of the big hurdles, I think, because we spend most of our time on the left, and the discussions that we have about the role of taxation and the redistributive aspects of it is that people are quite over reliant on the notion that taxes fund government spending in order to justify taxing the rich, for example. And I think I think that narrative actually doesn't serve them for that very well, because if you say that we need the taxes of the rich to fund government spending, what you're saying is that the government doesn't have any money of its own. And if the government doesn't have any money of its own, and if it's generally reliant on taxation to fund things, you're accepting the neoclassical narrative. And what you're saying is that you have to make sure that that the private sector, the capitalists within it, are, that you have their favor, because if they leave, you can't collect the taxes that you need. And so that narrative ultimately leads people to overestimate the importance of the rich in the economy, and they like to think of themselves as philanthropists and the ones that look out for the rest of us. Whereas the MMT approach would actually make them irrelevant in that sense. And I think that if people let go of the taxes fund government spending, and that's the only reason to fund to tax the rich, then they can start making arguments about, as you say, inequality, and the principal reason to tax the rich is inequality. And if inequality is the ultimate, is reducing inequality is the ultimate aim, then sure, taxation, but are there other means by which we can do that? And if we talk about we need to tax the rich, then as we said before, it's like making the good dependent on the bad. We don't need to rely on excessive profits are by itself inherently bad. It represents the exploitation of workers, in my view. And so that's something that we don't want, and so taxation should discourage activities and not make public purpose dependent on those bad activities.
The way MMT economist Scott Fulwiler puts it, he goes, if you need the ultra-rich to fund your progressive policies, what you're saying is you need there to always be the ultra-rich. It's a bit of a sticky proposition. Yeah. And so, what Randall Wray says is, look, we can always add income at the bottom, is what we're saying. We're not dependent on the rich for that. So, yeah, absolutely tax the rich because they're too rich. Good luck with that, because they've got so much political influence. Doesn't matter what you do with tax rates, they'll find a loophole. They'll get exemptions written into the law and stuff. I'm sorry to sound cynical about it, and I am, like I keep quoting Randall Wray. I think that's kind of what he says. What we can do is prevent the inequality in the first place through taxes. It's quite hard to claw it back off them once they've got it, but you could prevent the income in the first place. But like you say, if you make things dependent on taxing the rich, then both battles need fighting. I think I've said this before. Both battles need fighting. The rich need to be less rich. That is a battle that needs fighting. And the people at the bottom really are dying if they don't get enough income. So I'm just saying that you've got to break the link between the two. Let's fight those battles just on different days of the week, and they both need fighting. That's how I'd put it. But yeah, you're right. It does create a problem for the left in that, the right wingers are right when they say, hey, you should lower taxes and that will stimulate business activity. It will. If you lower taxes on people that have got more money than they know what to do with because they've got, offshored it and they're, all kinds, that's not actually going to stimulate activity because those people but they've spent all the money they're going to spend already. But if you lower the taxes on people who are like struggling or not even struggling, just on average, the medium income, they'll spend that money. If capitalism it thrives on sales. You don't shrink your business when there's orders are going up. The restaurant doesn't lay people off. When they're getting more and more bookings, they open for longer and they employ extra staff and expand. So if we think that's an all right system, then we should definitely be thinking about both sides of the taxation coin.
And then it sort of becomes a question as to whether you want an economy and a society where Jeff Bezos is employing thousands of people to be his footstool, versus an economy or society where the government is employing people to come and clean up your, the trash that's accumulating at the end of your street, or anything else.
Yeah. Let's have that debate.
And
that's a debate that I think we can win quite easily, don't you think? I mean,
there's not hordes of people in the street going, footstool, I really want that job.
Exactly. Okay, so everything at the moment is unfolding in the context of COVID-19 and the crisis, the global economic depression that's occurring as a result of that. The stock market may be going mad because people have money to put into assets, or we have a system that encourages people to speculate on stocks rather than saving money. But unemployment is spiking and continuing to spike. At the same time, we know that there are looming crises that the world has to deal with. In the West, we have aging populations, we have social care crises, we have mental health crises, we have a requirement to decarbonize rapidly to head off climate change, which will, regardless of whether you're interested in people's quality of life or the livelihood that one can extract from the earth, that will be a limiting factor if you let it get to that point. And as we say this, San Francisco has Blade Runner type skies from the wildfires that are going on there at the moment. This is not a problem that is going to be solved without some really serious effort. We have other problems. We have growing income and wealth inequality between generations in countries and geographically around the country and, of course, around the world. Again, focusing on the UK and the US. In the UK, I think we're in an interesting political context. We're in a context where we've had 10 years of austerity. It's very unpopular. It's seen as very unpopular. People are questioning the narrative there quite a bit. We also have people saying, well, how are we going to pay for the expenditure during the coronavirus crisis? And it may rear its head again, and that will be the next big political debate that's going to come here once we've resolved Brexit and the pandemic is sort of returning to a state of non-emergency. In the US, I imagine that the Republican Party, should Trump lose re-election, they will go back to being fiscal hawks, even in light of the trillions of dollars they spent on tax cuts that was funded by expanding the deficit. And Stephanie Kelton, who was Sanders's economics advisor, I think, and whose book we've mentioned before, has criticised Joe Biden's policy advisors for talking about the cupboard being bare economically. So there's a question there as to whether Biden, in light of perceived Trump mismanagement of the economy, will go to a policy of austerity. But in both of the big societies out there that we focus on, there's hope for political change. And in light of this, we have to come back to the Keynes quote right at the start of the episode, that the ideas of economists and political philosophers, whether they're right or whether they're wrong, can be more powerful than is commonly believed, that in fact the world is ruled by little else. And it's sort of a time when I think people will want to avoid business as usual and think of some bold new ideas and plans that can solve all of these problems. And the idea of MMT as a new deal, not just in the sense of economic stimulus to do things from government like FDR's New Deal, but as an actual new deal, a new social contract where you have this jobs guarantee and the role of the government, it is seen that the government has a role, an obligation to find useful work for people to do and to allocate a greater share of the resources in terms of labour and material resources that are in society towards work that is more socially useful and beneficial for everyone. That idea of the New Deal might be what's called for now. So how do you both view the prospects for MMT going forward? Do you think we're getting to a place where this is going to become a more mainstream understanding for economists and your own work, the people you speak to? How do you view the prospects for MMT moving on from the situation we're in now?
Certainly something that, there's a lot to think about there. I think if we look back at how far we've come, the MMT has, it didn't start in the last 5 years. It didn't start from 2008. It started before that. The economists that developed MMT predicted the financial crash and they're amongst the few economists that managed to do that. So, and even then, they had been ignored for quite some time, and it's taken a lot of effort. And I think if MMT has gotten anywhere, is to do, of course, with personalities like Stephanie Kelton and Warren Mosler and Randall Wray and the others who are good communicators and who have been persistent over all these years, but also an army of kind of activists and people who became interested in economics purely because of MMT. And that's really how the word has spread out. And it's an imperfect process because obviously not everybody is born just knowing how to speak about economics and knowing everything about MMT. And MMT is vast. We've just scratched the surface here. But I think if change is going to happen and if our governments are going to accept all these things that you say about the role of the government in creating employment and kind of pushing back on the idea that the market is the sole provider, then that's going to take kind of us hitting critical mass and having kind of from the bottom up pushing our politicians to do that. I think not even Bernie Sanders pushed on that narrative, even though he was for progressive politics. I think it's going to take a very long time for somebody from the top, for that change to come from the top. And I think it's going to be pushed from the bottom up. So I like to think that, the way that things have been going, that we are going to, going to be exponentially better within the next few years. But critically, now that after COVID, I'm 100% sure this austerity narrative is going to come back with a vengeance. And it already is, as you can see, but not just here, but also in Europe, potentially. Right now, European countries have been given a lot of freedom to spend. But I think at some point, people are going to be pushing back because they're going to be pushing back against public purpose. And that's what the whole austerity narrative is about. And we'll see what the impact of, the advancements and people's knowledge of MMT has done in the last couple of decades to actually push back on that. A lot less people knew about MMT in 2008 than they know now. So it remains to be seen.
Could I just interject briefly, sorry, before you come in, Christine, and just say that one thing I want to make really clear to everyone is that I think we should trust the public to have this kind of debate and to deal with these kind of ideas and to, if you don't agree with MMT, educate yourself about economics, listen to the MMT podcast that these guys host and, go and find it out and actually deal with these substantive ideas. I think there's a perception that people aren't interested or don't want to know or can't understand this stuff. And I think it's so patronizing. And I think we see, and you guys will have seen in your efforts at communicating with people, that when people realize how relevant this stuff is to their lives, they do care and they do want to learn about it and they do want to, figure out whether this stuff is right and work out what the consequences would be for them and all this sort of thing. And I think we just have to trust people and say they're smart enough to understand things if you give them the resources and the time and mental space and permission to learn about this stuff. I think that's the cornerstone of a democracy. It kind of depends on that, doesn't it? Is the ability to trust your citizens to make decisions. And that's the perspective that I would look at your whole work from, and what I'm trying to do with this episode, exploring an issue that I think is really important for people to grapple with, even if they don't agree with anything we're saying here, to think about these issues in real terms and what they might mean, I think is really important.
I often say, if I'm talking to people, listen to our podcast, because it's not just me rabbiting on. There's obviously Patricia, who's like really smart, and also we're interviewing these. We're interviewing a lot of the primary MMT scholars. And they are great communicators, as Patricia says, and they've been at it since the 90s as well. That's how far back it goes. It's a 25 years plus of scholarly work gone into it. So there is always more to discover. But I think, yes, we should trust the people, because you look at it, most adults learn to drive. Right, 20, 30 hours, they learn to drive. And there's real fatal consequences for messing that up. But somehow we all seem to get there. And I think this is, you put a few hours into it, you can understand central banking operations, which then allows you to understand why QE didn't cause runaway inflation, and why it actually didn't really do anything. It didn't expand the economy. It didn't really help. And for instance, but more importantly, it helps you to understand how the money system works. It's the most potent institution in our lives, I think. It really is. And once you understand that it's not a commodity, and it shouldn't be a commodity, it shouldn't have the character of a commodity, that it is a policy tool, it's a utility. It's a policy tool for moving resources from the private sector into public sector use. And because it is technically it's a tax credit. A £5 note is a £5 tax credit. It guarantees you £5 off your tax bill. That's what it guarantees you. But because of that, it has all these other things you can do with it. But once you understand that and where it comes from, then you get to then go, okay, right, there are limits. Taxation is really, really important. It really is, like you say, it helps, shape the moral character of the economy in a way as well, taxation. But once you understand all these things, you can actually talk about politics in a substantive way, rather than the government's going to run out of money, the cupboard's bare, all these sort of household analogous things, which have really been keeping our political aspirations tied up. Whether we're on the left of centre or the right of centre, it really has, really limited our ability to achieve what we aspire to as people participating in a democracy. So that's the importance of it. And and that's how we ended up doing the podcast, I think, because politicians talk the way they do. They use the household analogy, the cupboard is bare, spending like a drunken sailor, drowning in debt. They use all this household analogy stuff because it's the way we talk as an electorate, and it's not their job to change the culture. That their job is to work with the culture and get votes and win elections. So they're not out there trying to change people and educate them. And so the only way it's going to change is grassroots, as I see it. Also, it's the only thing I have to work with. I don't actually have any sort of elite connections. I'm not going to be able to change anything top down. So that's our whole effort, really. I think, if I could speak for you as well, Patricia, I think
Yeah,
that's
for sure.
we are saying, look, you can understand this stuff, and and it is really, really important. But like you say, I think once people take a toe in the water and they hear somebody like Stephanie Kelton speak or read the first few pages of her book, you're going to be, wow, I'm hooked. It really is. These are people that want you to understand something.
I am deeply mistrusting of any academic, economists in particular, who kind of wish the masses would just go away, and I think a good economist. Good economists want people to discuss economics. They know how central it is to their lives, and they want people to understand things, like Christian says.
So, of course, hypothetically, if my audience has listened to this and is interested, you all know what to do. You can go and listen to the Modern Monetary Theory podcast for explanations not only of MMT 101, as we've discussed today, but also, of course, lots of other things about how inflation works, how government bonds work, how international trade works, all from an MMT perspective. Every time I listen to this, I learn something new about how this works and how people are theorizing about it and so on. And I think it's a really awesome and important show that you guys have developed there as a learning resource for people. It's a good resource that you developed there. And if this has piqued your interest, what here shall miss, your toil shall strive to mend, and all that sort of thing. So the last thing I'd like to say is thanks both very much for being so generous with your time and giving up your evening to talk to me about modern monetary theory.
No, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate enormously what you're doing here, and yeah, I think you're one of the good ones.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right back at you, because you've done the hard work of building your audience, and and so we're grateful to you for having us.
Well, you're very welcome. Come back and we'll talk about the economy sometime in the future.
Love to.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode. You can find the Modern Monetary Theory podcast wherever you're listening to this, and I really do recommend it if you want to hear much more about details on MMT directly from the economists who are working on this stuff. The podcast is on Twitter at MMT Podcast, where you can also find Christian and Patricia's own accounts if you want to follow them. They also have a Patreon like we do with bonus episodes, so check that out as well if you want even more stuff. And many thanks again to them for coming on the show. As for our show, we're on the web at physicspodcast.com. Any comments, questions, concerns, things you'd like to hear about, feedback for these episodes, which I know is a little outside what we often talk about, please do let me know. I'd love to hear what you think, and the contact form is there. It goes to my email. I try to respond to everything that people send. If you found this useful, you can support the show on PayPal. Any donations are gratefully received, and you can subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/physicalattraction, where you will find many bonus episodes, including the complete SoftBank series, which goes out for 7 episodes or so, and some Climate 201 episodes ahead of their general release, as well as some episodes that are only on the Patreon for subscribers there. Thanks to those of you who have done that already. All of the details, alongside where to find us on social media, are on that website at physicspodcast.com. Until next time then, please do take care.